Hello everyone, and welcome to my first extensive guide for a faction. Since my name has been made with USF, I thought this should be the first one to go over. So for anyone that doesn't know me, who am I? Well, I'm DevM, a top Company of Heroes 2 and Company of Heroes 1 player, and back in the old days of Company of Heroes 1, I made my name mostly by playing USF. Now obviously USF from Company of Heroes 1 and USF from Company of Heroes 2 are different, but the same principles apply for the most part. Also, about this video, I won't go deep into unit stats. For that there are various resources and YouTubers such as Tightrope. And also keep in mind that some things can change with patches, but I have made an effort of bringing many points that are universal no matter which patch you're seeing this on. So what makes the USF faction a good choice? Well, they have a really good early game and early to mid game transition. This means that if played right, most games are done by the 10-minute mark. And because most of their heavy hit tech hits at about the same time, then there is a really big snowball effect, where the opponent struggles to find a counter for everything at once. There is also the fact that late game they have the best tank destroyer, which especially in team games can be really useful. In the early to mid game transition and mid game, they also have one of the best manpower trading moments, where their light vehicles do most of the damage. Then you can just pop the vehicle crew out and repair the damage, which adds more to the snowball effect that I previously mentioned. No other faction can really do this of harassing with the vehicles and having the vehicle self-repair. With that said, there are obvious negatives, and these are usually the ones that cause USF their loss. They have difficulty many times entering the mid to late game stages, with a good unit composition that works versus everything the enemy has. This is usually the point where the Riflemen are not dominating the infantry engagements already, your light vehicles are being zoned by the enemy AT-guns, and the enemy has at least a tank out, and building a Jackson to counter it means neglecting the anti-infantry department, where the Riflemen are already struggling. This situation usually hits at different points, to be honest, but happens in both the Aussie and the OKW matchups. They also suffer from the fact that, in my opinion, they have the worst tier 4 tank, which is the Sherman. The Shermans can't really go pound to pound against the OKW P4, and scale worse than the Aussie Panzer IV. So usually just use them in some special occasions, usually to snowball the game further. Also, USF struggles to maintain a good manpower war attrition. In many cases, just because of the fact that it's hard to get the right units out without going out of your way to get them tech-wise. Their indirect fire units, such as the mini howitzer, leaves the faction many times exposed to full-on offensive attacks. Finally, USF has no real non-commander artillery unit, such as the Katyusha or the Panzerwerfer. Now that you have some pros and cons to contextualize yourself, let's go over the mindset while playing USF. USF, like Soviets, wants to be the aggressor, and that means having constant pressure on the enemy, only with small breaks in which we'll talk on later when I talk about manpower conservation. If you are being the aggressor and you get to choose where you want your fights and make the opponent react to you, this usually means that you are most of the time in their territory, and thus is not attacking your own sectors. It's always more beneficial to be the aggressor. Even if you slightly lose an engagement and get some decaps, it's still going to be the time where your opponent isn't getting resources and he has to recap the points. Also, because USF offers so many tools to deal manpower damage early to mid game, being aggressive many times through certain key points in the match means that your opponent will be pressured to even reinforce the squads many times and tech at the same time. If your opponent gets stuck on the same tech as you, that's what you want, since it's when your opponent is allowed to tech that they get that mid to late game transition where they have every tool to counter everything you have, which obviously you don't want. Think of it like the techniques of Jiu-Jitsu, where in every technique there's a big focus on leaving your opponent uncomfortable. If he's somewhat comfortable while you're doing the technique, then you are doing something wrong. With that said, when I say aggression, it's also smart aggression. If the first few engagements went wrong, then you have to play smart on the engagements. I maybe want to stop trading so much and give some breathing room to my opponent, to have some breathing room on my own, and wait for my faction's power spikes. So let's go to the unit overview now. First off, we have the rear echelon. This is your basic engineer unit, and I see them basically as a moving minesweeper and a bazooka platform to soft counter enemy vehicles or support your AT guns when they are rushed. Their anti-infantry capabilities are limited. With that said, they many times are the difference between losing or winning an early engagement, since their damage is still significant then. They can also build green cover on some important points such as the fuel with their tank traps and the wire. You see that in many top level games. And finally, they also have another important job, which is to smoke for your rifleman pushes when grenades are teched. Next up we have the Riflemen. Riflemen are the backbone of your army. They have snares at Vet 1. They are probably also the best infantry unit once you get the double BARs. This is considering their timing because they eventually get outmatched. They are also really versatile in the sense that you can use them effectively at many ranges. Obviously some are worse, but it's not like they do no damage like some other units. Lastly, they also have grenades, which can really help out clearing team weapons and surprise wipe some of your opponent's squads. They also excel at close range, but their medium range is also really good. Next up is the mortar. The mortar in the context of USF is a really niche unit. It used to be that in the old days it was really good, or broken really, in terms of accuracy. But these days in general it's not built unless you really need a fast support unit to smoke for your advances. The reason being that you don't see the mortar much, even for this, it's because you'll eventually have those same tools in the form of the mini howitzer, and even the Sherman and rear echelon have the smoke ability. But that is later on. What about earlier on? Why doesn't it really fit the narrative of USF? Well, USF wants to be the aggressor, and if you build the mortar, you're going to be in the back foot in the infantry engagements for sure. I think this unit only has its space on the lower echelon of ranked play, where players still don't fully utilize the rifleman to counter static positions such as MGs in buildings. But if you can counter the MGs with just the rifleman, then this unit becomes eventually obsolete to players that have climbed a bit further in the ladder. Next up, it's the ambulance. Not much to talk here, the ambulance is a must-have unit for every game. Sometimes it can be used in team games to a forward position, but that's usually a trade-off as well, since it can be a prime target for enemy artillery. Next up, the Lieutenant. This unit is basically your 4th rifleman. When it hits the field, it's the best close range unit you will have, and it also serves many times as a buffer unit for the light vehicle counters coming up next, since it can be upgraded with a bazooka. Usually in my games, I end up with a bazooka on the Lieutenant in 95% of them, because there's always some sort of light vehicle in the hands of Ossier or OKW. Especially versus Ossier, it can really help the Stuart survive until you have double zooks on the rear echelons or an AT gun out. It's also one more smoke platform, since you usually have one single rear echelon by that part of the game. For most of the game, the Lieutenant in conjunction with the rear echelon will be your smoking providing units for your infantry pushes. So it's important that you keep track on where you send the unit on the field. Next up, the HMG. This MG is probably one of the best, even if nerfed in the most recent patch, as of the making of this video. It's also vital versus many types of unit compositions, plus it can hold the map a bit when you inevitably retreat the rifleman for some healing. It's also a good support unit for when the riflemen push in. since your opponent will be focused on the whole tsunami of Riflemen flooding in. They are usually not aware of the HMG moving in as well, and position itself. It also has armor piercing rounds, which can cause real damage to light vehicles, and to an unaware player that usually ends up with a dead vehicle, since in many times in lower level games, if you pop these out as soon as the light vehicle engages the MG, they are always surprised at how fast it kills the light vehicle. Next up, the M20. The M20 was also recently buffed in terms of the timing, as of the making of this video as well. This is a utility vehicle and infantry harassing unit. It offers really good anti-tank mines, and it's really an annoyance throughout the match, especially when paired up with other light vehicles from this tier, such as the Stuart. When played with the Stuart, each can occupy, for example, a sector of the map, and a single enemy AT gun that he has by that point of the game has to choose which one he wants to deal with. Thus, it usually provides you with like 4 minutes of map control superiority. Next up, the Stuart. The Stuart is USF's primary vehicle, I would say, for the mid game. It's a good anti-infantry and light vehicle counter, especially versus Austere, since they don't have a Puma like OKW. They are good at causing bleed on the opponent when it hits the field, helping clear out MGs as well, and it also has good utility to enemy vehicle rushes since it can stun their turret. When it hits the field, it's your main trading unit as well. It can also work as a counter for units like the Panzer Grenadiers since they don't have any AT capabilities. Next up, the Captain. The Captain, like the Lieutenant, is usually a 4th Rifleman substitute. The difference is it really doesn't have a bazooka upgrade. For me, the Captain's job really is to be one more unit in the field with access to smoke, and the fact that sometimes it can hit when you don't have BARs upgraded yet, and that unit can have one without that upgrade, obviously. There's also the ability to improve building times for units that are being built in some kind of tier, but honestly it's a really niche ability that is not used much, but it's good to know anyways that it's there. If you have the Captain in base after being retreated and happen to be building a tank, then you can use it. Next up, the USF AT gun. I'll say this is one of the best AT guns once vetted, and if you have the munitions available to use its ability. Then I would argue it's one of the best AT guns. The only problem usually with this one is exactly that it's munition angry many times, which can, it's hard many times to use that ability when as USF you need to pop BARs on Riflemen, you need to use smokes for the pushes, you need to upgrade bazookas on the rear echelons, you need to throw grenades at the MGs, and try to use commander abilities, the list goes on. When that happens, then the AT guns can many times barely penetrate the tanks such as the OKW Panzer IV, and that's when this AT gun can feel a bit crappy. Now, next up, the AAF track. I think this is a pretty good unit. The only downside in usage is really due to the fact that the Stuart is overshadowing it a bit. But it's still a good unit. It deals good damage versus the austere light vehicles and offers a good suppression platform against the enemy infantry. The only if about this one as well is that in terms of micro, it can be a more taxing unit, since sometimes it has a weird behavior. Next up, the mini howitzer. It's a really good indirect fire unit. It's really a beast of unit in terms of stats in my opinion. It's good at dealing with static positions and in a certain way the substitute of the sniper in terms of its role. It causes manpower damage to the enemy without receiving any. This unit and the M8A1 or the Scott are your late game heroes many times, since you'll be struggling to push through the positions without some kind of indirect fire. The downfall for this unit really is where it's located in terms of decking. You usually have to go out of your way to get this one and dealing other important counters. Next up, the Major. The Major has basically 4 jobs it can possibly do once it hits the field. The first one is being one or more rear echelon, in the sense that you can get a Zook on it and just blob him up with the rear echelons and hope that his bazooka is the difference maker in killing a tank, basically. The next one is more of a capping unit. If you need all your Riflemen on a side of the map, but you know that you have sectors you need to capture meanwhile, then it's the job of the Major to do it. Third is the Major Artillery. It can, in many late game scenarios, help out your pushes through MG fire, or even clear AT guns when your tanks rush it. Finally, and more especially in team games, it can be used as a forward retreat point. Again, this has its pros and cons. Next up, the Sherman. So, the Sherman I already talked a bit about in the intro, but overall it's a really good anti-infantry tank when it uses those AG shells, and can many times surprise wipe a squad, to be honest. It's also a decent anti-tank platform, but I consider it more of a supporting unit to other AT platforms such as the Jackson and AT guns. I usually only build a Sherman really once I hit tier 4, and I know that, for example, the Jackson isn't really needed yet, but I still want to push my current advantage. It's also useful to pop smoke for infantry pushes, and basically be a dedicated anti-infantry unit overall. It really suffers in the fact that at the time it hits the field, it won't do the job you need in a good way for long. What I mean is your opponent is getting a P4 by the time you also get the Sherman, and the Sherman only really trades well with the P4 for a short time, especially since in 90% of your games your tech path will be Lieutenant into Major. Then you won't have an AT gun, and relying on the Sherman for AT is a big mistake, since it's also fairly squishy. You won't expect AT gun shots to bounce from the Sherman, obviously, which means the usual austere build order, with the usual build order from the austere, it will be an easy target for pack guns. Next up, the Jackson, one of the pearls, you could say, of the faction. In team games, many times you pick USF just to have this one unit late game. It has a good range, a good penetration, good damage. Its vet is also really good, and it also has a really good ability to kill tanks. It's your backbone versus OKW late game, since it's the only thing you have to deal with the OKW tanks while being out of the racket and firing range many times. Overall, the 145 fuel for this is completely worth it. Next up, the M8A1 or the Scott. Finally, the M8A1 in conjunction with the Howitzer. They are going to be your main indirect fire units for those sluggish games where manpower attrition is the main struggle. It also has beast accuracy. As of the making of this video, it's possible it will be slightly nerfed on its auto fire capabilities. It's really hard to say how good it will be, but it's going to be compensated on the barrages. Either way, this is the tank you're going to replace most of the time with the Sherman for late game anti-infantry capabilities and manpower damage, since its extended range means it's out of the harm's way of the sneaky Raketans or pack shots. Now on to the commanders. So first off, the Airborne Company. I really like this commander. It's one of my favorites since it really offers advantages for every stage of the match. There are two strong points for this commander. The first one is that it can drop HMGs and AT guns. This means that when doing your tech path, if you go for LT, you'll have an AT gun, and if you go for the captain, you'll have HMGs. This is a really strong characteristic, especially against OKW where you need a combined arms approach in the mid game to late game. This commander just excels. It's really good that when you go LT, you can support your sword with an AT gun. The second strong point is the last ability, the P-47 rocket strike. which is just so strong in tank rushes to help out wipe enemy tanks, and in anti-rushes as well. The planes just do so much damage against vehicles, really. Lastly, the paratroopers are a worthwhile mention. You get some rifleman squad wiped, which gives you some space in your army composition, obviously, to place them. Then they can be a really good substitute, since when they are vetted and upgraded with LMGs, they just wipe infantry left and right. I also want to point out that for my team games, this is probably the commander I use the most, with a close second being Tactical Company. Next up, Armor Company. The Armor Commander is another one I really like. I even have my portrait done with it. So this commander has two really strong points. One of them is having the Wolverine or the M10 tank destroyer and the Bulldozer Sherman. The M10 is 90 fuel, so it's really cheap. This means that in games where you are struggling for an anti-tank counter and you are already being pressured by either an OKWP4 or Austere P4, and your fuel sectors are being captured and you are far away from the Jackson, which is 145 fuel, then you can start popping these out as a band-aid kind of approach. That's just one situation, because in reality I think they do well on their own and can be a replacement for Jacksons if done in good numbers. It always depends on what you're up against and the playstyles that you want to use. The other strong point is the Bulldozer Sherman. It's more beefy than your usual Sherman, while keeping its anti-infantry capabilities. Obviously it's not really strong versus other tanks, but really when you use it you should have some kind of anti-tank out already. It has been an important unit also for me in tournaments from the past. Finally, another worthwhile mention to this commander is the artillery. While it's heavily RNG based, it's a really good zoning tool because of it. You pop that in some area and your opponent, unless he's very brave, he just has to retreat from there and keep out of the area for a while. It's usually good yet again when paired with a vehicle rush and used on top of the enemy AT guns to clear them out. Next up, the Heavy Cavalry Company. The Heavy Cavalry Commander is an okay-ish commander for me. It used to be better. I mean, it used to be super good when the Pershing was just an overall beast. These days though, it still maintains the strong point of the Pershing when the game allows it, of course, but usually use it for the Rangers as kind of the shock troopers of USF, and for the Riflemen field defenses. It allows Riflemen to spam mines all over and build their own sandbags, which is really strong, especially on top level games. There's also the Smoke Call-in, which can be really useful as well to deny MGs. I think this commander only starts being fully utilized really at a higher level of play, when the players just spam mines with Riflemen and use that smoke ability for some good pushes. It also has the combined arms, which again, I think it's a really good ability, but it doesn't really mesh with the Pershing Call-in. Because usually with combined arms you want to have multiple vehicles or tanks, in my opinion, and combined arms is best used with that amount of tanks, and usually when you go for the Pershing you will only have the Pershing for the most part. Okay, so next up, Infantry Company. Infantry Company I consider mostly a team game commander as well, but I have always thought that it had its place in 1v1, especially versus OKW, because Riflemen will usually start to struggle against Volks at all ranges, and the LMGs make it possible for the Riflemen to have a winning range, as I see it. It also has a mortar F-track, which in team games is really good. With all this said, in a 1v1 scenario it gets overshadowed, in my opinion, by the tactical support commander. So I would use that one over this one if possible, But for anyone who only has this one and not that one, it's okay to use this one as well. Next up, the Mechanized Company. Mechanized is currently the top 1 commander for 1v1. It's just so good in helping USF snowball the game, which is what USF really wants. The Jeep versus the Austere Grenadiers just bleeds them out with some good micro, if you can keep out of the fast range. Versus OKW, you can put a Rifleman inside a Jeep and chase down squads. And then you have the Cavalry Riflemen that when they hit the field they just demolish any infantry they find. Then the commander keeps on giving really with the 76mm Sherman that you can build. It can go hand to hand with the OKW P4 and the Austere P4 while keeping some of the good anti-infantry capabilities. And finally, the cherry on top of it is it has the combined arms ability. When you have 2 of these Shermans or maybe more and you rush in and you use this ability, then the Shermans just start firing at a crazy rate. It's really the best commander for 1v1 right now. Next up, the Recon Sports company. Recon Sport has 2 really strong points for me. The first one is the M8. The M8 is like the Stuart in the role it occupies, but on steroids versus infantry. It deals such good damage versus infantry, and you can even do the Stuart, and eventually when you get the CPs you call in the M8 and just rush the enemy AT gun. And I can guarantee you that anything that isn't a high level player many times will lose the game to this one push, especially if you steal the AT gun while doing it. The second strong point are the cluster mines, which are a wiping machine. They are especially used yet again when pushing in with vehicles to clear AT guns, or even to clear MGs to make way for your riflemen. Even sometimes in more action-centric matches, if your opponent is capturing a sector somewhere, you can sometimes wipe a squad by just using it in the sector. Okay, next up, the Rifle Company. Rifle Company is one of the worst commanders in my opinion. When I say worst, I don't mean it's useless, it still has some good abilities, but it's not as straightforward or doesn't offer the off-the-bat advantages as some other commanders do. This one is more of a cheesy commander as I see it. You can spam rear echelons and upgrade them with flamers. So it's a very niche commander for me, and I rarely use it, and I rarely see it used at a high level as well. Next up, Tactical Support. Tactical Support is a good commander, I would say. It's the better version of the Infantry Company as I see it. It's really good for team games where USF usually lacks that artillery unit like the Panzerwerfer. In 1v1 it's mostly used to deal with the double Raketen or the double pack setup that sometimes it's hard to crack without a perfect push. And pushes are obviously risky. The strong point is the Calliope, since it does just that, with the second strong point being the LMGs for the Riflemen yet again. Next up, on the last one I guess, Urban Assault. Urban Assault is like the twin brother of Tactical Support. It offers the same main strength, so sometimes it comes down to preference. As I see it, they are both good and the same main strength is there. In conclusion, for 1v1 my preferred commanders are Mechanized. A top 2 would be Airborne, I would say. And finally a top 3, either Armor Company or Tactical Support. They are both good choices and probably both worth of that top 3 spot. For team games, definitely Airborne or Tactical Support, I would say. Now we are going to talk about taking paths. There are 2 main paths you can really take. The most used one goes for the Lieutenant first, so your build order will look something like this. 3 Riflemen, Lieutenant. If the fuel allows it, then Steward first. If not, then you get HMG. And then when the fuel allows it, you go for the Steward. With an ambulance, generally after the Steward, it's when you do it to minimize manpower loss. Then Major into Sherman if you do it fast enough, and or the Jackson. The rack upgrade is usually done after the ambulance as well. The main strength of this build order is really just the amount of anti-infantry you have, with very capable anti-tank support with the Zooks and the Steward. The downside of the Lieutenant approach is if you have a bad early game and then you can be struggling in munitions, so the Zooks can be hard to get. The Steward can get delayed in terms of fuel, and then you get this point where the enemy is getting a P4 by the time you only have Zooks and the Steward, and that means that the game can go south for you very quickly. The second build order is the Captain one. 3 Riflemen yet again into Captain, AAF track usually in replacement of the Steward, and then the AT gun to support it. The main idea being that in terms of AT for the future, you won't be in a bad place. Also for the late game you already have the Captain tier teched, so the mini howitzer isn't that far off. Then you go into Major and maybe a Sherman yet again. Since with this build order you somewhat cover the weakness of the Sherman, the AT guns can do the AT job, the Jackson isn't as needed. The weakness of this one is obviously you won't have the HMG first of all, which is a really good unit to counter infantry in general and help Riflemen win their engagements, so it's really noticeable versus OKW when you don't have one. The second one is obviously you don't have the Steward. The Steward is overall a better generalist unit than the AAF track. Out of these two, the Lieutenant build order is the one I use in 95% of my games. But in team games you do have more of a choice since the priorities change and the Captain might not be as bad there. Now, another important topic on teching are all the adaptations you can make mid-game depending on your situation, which I think isn't really a topic mentioned many times, but since I'm going for a more complete guide I'll go over it. It's really hard to give a general rule on this because every situation has different variables going for it. With that said, I'm going to try my best explaining it. Before delving into that though, I need to first talk about the unit compositions. The main idea is that usually you want about a 50-50 ratio with an anti-infantry and anti-tank capabilities in your army. Neglect one too much and bad things happen. However, there are different flavors as well to the same end goal. If you want a counter to the OKW tanks, then you have for example the Jacksons, you have AT guns, you have the 76mm Shermans. All of these have different strengths and can offer the same end goal. The most important difference is how they interact with what your opponent has. There are 3 unit compositions that usually end up in the late game as USF, and you can change between the 3 of them depending on what your opponent has or how your resources are looking. The first one has been seen a lot in the past tournament. It's the 76mm Sherman spam. Usually when you have a good generalist tank with any faction you can get away with this kind of unit composition. The 76mm Sherman has both anti-infantry and anti-tank capabilities, meaning that if you are losing infantry engagements, then this fills that gap and at the same time works as an anti-tank force, especially when you rush in and make use of the full mobility that a tank has. This is a good approach for when you have a lot of fuel and your enemy doesn't have a sizable tank force, let's say 1 OKWP4, and the rest is infantry with a Raketan somewhere in there. The same unit composition could be said for us here, where they have 1 P4 and usually a pack gun. When this happens, you can just keep stacking Shermans, and eventually, even if the opponent gets a second P4, you'll usually have 4 Shermans by that time, which will outnumber the enemy tanks. It's really the safest approach of the bunch, because even if your infantry gets wiped, you have ways to deal with the infantry pushes. The second one is usually composed of Jacksons with M8A1s. The Jacksons fill the AT role and the M8A1s the anti-infantry role. This one is also highly fuel dependent, so the main difference between why you would want this one over the last one is, for example, if your opponent has a good amount of AT guns, that would zone out your 76mm Shermans. With Jacksons and M8A1s, it's all about the long range. It also has the added benefit that the Jacksons can deal with the Panthers and other heavy armored units. The downside is that you are more susceptible to infantry pushes, really, since obviously the Jacksons won't be doing the job for you. The third one and last one is usually something along the lines of double AT gun with Shermans or M8A1s. It's a more defensive one, but it's less fuel hungry of the bunch. And the one you will usually be relying when you are down on fuel and you need some AT counter. Now, knowing all of these three unit compositions for the late game as USF, there are small adaptations you can do to each of them when in the middle of the match. There are really many adaptations to consider. Is your opponent zoning your tanks out with AT guns, but he has tanks of his own that you need to deal with? Well, consider doing some AT guns with your 76mm Shermans. Does your opponent have AT guns that again zone your tanks out, but he also has a sizable infantry force compared to yours, and you feel that if he rushes you, he will decrease your AT guns? Well, maybe consider a Jackson then. The list goes on. In the mini adaptations you can really make it's sizable, the amount of them. It's really hard to go over all of them. The important part is that you keep a balance between anti-infantry and anti-tank, while the units you select to be the anti-tank can do their job well. That means if your opponent is rushing you with infantry 24/7, for instance, then maybe AT guns will be less of a counter, and you want to have it to be a vehicle such as the Jackson. Keep in mind that there is also the resource aspect of all of this. Even if you don't have the perfect unit composition, since you don't have the fuel, then go for the next best, even if that means it will be a more risky approach. It's better really than obviously losing the game. The next important topic is pushing advantages and coming back from either bad starts or bad game phases. First, I will go over what happens when you fall behind. First of all, the main idea when falling behind is this: conserve manpower. That means you'll be less aggressive, and one of two things will also happen. One of them is you will avoid your opponent's army and just cap the sectors that are far off from where the action previously was. The second is to keep your units all in the same general area and working in combination. I usually avoid my opponent when he has some kind of unit out that I can't deal with, but he can't be everywhere at once with that particular unit, right? So let's say I'm playing against OKW and he has a Panzer II out, but I have no counter. Well, then I usually split my army, and the Panzer II can't really be on two sides of the map at once. That means I can do some work while having no counters out, opposed to sending everything to one place and having my units mass retreat because the Panzer II just goes to that side of the map. The second one of keeping the units together usually is when you already have a bit of everything. That means you have a bit of a counter for everything he has, but you are still losing the battles. The best way is to keep the synergy between your units, namely the Riflemen, the HMGs, the AT guns, still there, and do a slow advance through the map, while you maybe keep 30% of the map's territory, to get that extra unit you need out, let's say a Jackson for instance. You can also more or less do both of them at different points in a game. If you got pushed out of your 30% of the map, then maybe go for the opposite side of the map with your whole force. Retake some territories with low resistance since your opponent just pushed you off the other part of the map. That means he probably has most of his units there. And you repeat this process until eventually you have the unit composition you need. So it's really a stalling game. There is also the fact that when you do this, you want to do early retreats and to avoid fighting out losing battles, unless you are desperate for VPs, in which case it's a whole different problem. Usually when behind as well, you will struggle for fuel. That means your unit composition will change and you'll probably rely more on AT guns and HMGs for a longer time, since they aren't fuel dependent. Don't be afraid to use this. You can and should eventually get some tanks out when you can, and hold on to at least one VP so you don't bleed out on VPs before you do have your perfect unit composition. Now, for USF in specific, the captain tier is usually in the higher level of games, the sign that the game didn't go like the USF player wanted. So he needs to rely on non-fuel anti-tank units such as the AT guns and the bazookas. That is the right answer to a lack of fuel, really. When there is a lack of manpower though, as long as you have the fuel, then vehicles is usually the best, since they trade HP for manpower with the enemy. However, if you don't have fuel, then you need units such as the mini howitzer or the Scott, that is if you at least tech to major and can get the cheapest vehicle out. It's important when transitioning from mid to late game, you have units that can trade effectively with the enemy, so he isn't just piling up on manpower. It's usually in that transition that you get these units, because it's when riflemen stop being so effective at trading, and so are the light vehicles. They are usually zoned out with T-guns or enemy tanks. Your opponent will already have a front line of sorts established by this time of the game. Now, when you are ahead, it's a whole different story. The name of the game is deplete your opponent's manpower, and you take advantage of the timing of your units, and this is really where you should be in 80% of your games, I would say. The main idea is that you obviously want to use the timings of your units and upgrades to have favorable engagements, where you win out in the end result in terms of manpower attrition. But when ahead, even bad trades can be good. If you are, for example, piling up on 300 manpower, and your opponent is struggling with 100 manpower, then even if you lose 200 manpower and he loses his 100 manpower, it's more beneficial for you, since you can keep the aggression and you can keep up with the costs. For USF in specific, pushing advantages is tight when you get your important tech out. First of all, when the Stuart is out, it's one of the points where you should be on your opponent's face, really, and looking to take out as much manpower as you can. The second part is when you get BARs out. So your rifleman will for some time completely outtrade the enemy infantry. So you keep doing this, so your opponent has a difficult time getting his own tech and counters out, while maintaining a decent map control. As soon as he lets go of the gas pedal just a little bit to tech, he loses all of his map. This is, for me, a point where many players, excluding high level players, don't really do. They are okay with having 70% of the map and letting the opponent have a little breathing room for a while, and uses manpower to tech, and he then gets the unit composition he wants. Anyways, the third part is usually when you get your major out and the first tank out. That's usually USF at its peak, really. Your riflemen are still beating the enemy infantry in theory, your light vehicles are still overall being useful, and now you have a tank on top of that. Abusing these three timings are important for USF, so don't let go of the gas pedal. The only downtimes in the early to mid game should only really be when you are waiting for your ambulance to heal your units. Lastly, I think it's important to note that USF can very easily lose just from the manpower bleed from the mid to late game stage. So just because of how their units are matching up to the enemy units, it's important that you either play around that by building the mini howitzer or the M8A1 and bleed your opponent out that way, or be an aggressive player and do multiple pushes throughout the late game. That means if you are playing something like 376mm Shermans or a unit composition that is missing either the mini howitzer or the Scott, then the only way many times for you not to lose the game and slowly bleed out is to rush your opponent using everything you have, including smokes and commander abilities, and try to trade with your opponent evenly if possible. In my opinion, in even trades, USF always comes out ahead because you can more easily replace the vehicles. Generally saying, standing idle with USF is a bad idea. Next topic is Rifleman usage. Their usage, like any other mainline infantry from the other factions, define how well you will do. The first thing I'll say is the Riflemen are the heavy lifters until about late game, where they take more of a supportive role in the sense that they will be the ones decrewing AT guns for your vehicle onslaught. To get there you have a lot of work. First of all, the way you play with Riflemen depends if you are up against OKW or Ossier. I already have some matchup specific videos that you can watch, but I'll go over the differences in playstyle versus one and the other. Before going into that, I can still go into 4 different smaller topics that aren't really related to USF in specific, but to aggressive factions in general. The first one being, if you want to be good at using Riflemen, or eventually use them at their full potential, you need to be good at reading where your enemy's units are through the fog of war. You need to keep an eye out for the MG and where it might be, where the Grenadiers might be, if there are enemy units scattered around the map that you can pick off of and win the map off of that. Try and analyze replays and see where easy units were. This is the best way to achieve this. Try and use the rear echelon sometimes to scout out and get in and out of buildings to scout as well. There are lots of ways you can and should do this. It's especially important in the early game, which is the part of the game where you want to excel as USF. The second topic is when to blob. People say blobbing is bad, and in general it is true, but there are times and places for it. Usually if your opponent is stretched thin, and if you have smoke to back you up or anything that can displace an MG, or even better, if you know the MG isn't in the general area, then you can rush in to gain something out of it. Usually an AT gun is the objective, or there is also the fact that when you blow up and you catch a retreating squad, you can usually wipe it. The third is always be thinking about numbers advantage, and I really talk about this in a lot of my videos, and it's really important that you know this. If you have three Riflemen out and your opponent has 1 MG and 2 Grenadiers out, then if you can get a Grenadier out of the field because he was capping somewhat alone, then taking out the 1 MG and 1 Grenadier next is going to be much easier. The fourth one, and I covered this also in a video that I did about AE, don't do unnecessary retreats. If you want to be aggressive and you always have 1 Rifleman in base because you had to retreat it from somewhere, then it's going to be very detrimental to your offense, and it's always going to feel like the time to push just isn't right. Which you could see this point basically being as the counterpoint to the numbers advantage rule that I mentioned before. You never give numbers advantage to your opponent if you can avoid it. you just soft retreat the unit. Now, onto USF specifics. Versus Austere, your Riflemen actually win out versus Grenadiers most of the time. This means that your main worry is flanking the MG and avoiding the Pioneer at close range. Why? Because the Pioneer early game actually swings engagements quite hard. It's like a mini Stern Pioneer, really. To do that, you first get an idea where the MG and Grenadiers are. Then you need to see if they are in a position where you can rush in without losing too much HP. This means use sight blockers and green cover. When playing versus Austere, there is usually kind of a bait or scouting rifleman that is used to do just that. Best case scenario, you can get behind a green cover wall and let the MG firing at that baiting or scouting rifleman, and then the next two riflemen shouldn't be close to that one and should be flanking the MG from some other position. If the MG starts running away, you can start focusing firing the Grenadiers and have just one of the riflemen chase the MG. It's this simple, really. Don't disregard the Grenadiers since they do have a lot of damage, but always keep his MG on the move if you can. In the middle of the engagements, also keep the lower health rifleman in cover and focusing firing something, and the high health squads chasing the MG or rushing the positions of the Grenadiers. Keep an eye out for which squad the Grenadiers are focusing, it's really important. If they are focusing a rifleman and you have two of them, quickly put that rifleman in cover and let the other rifleman close the distance first. The devil is in the details in Company of Heroes engagement. There is always a juggle between which squad your enemy is focusing. The bottom line is you are trying to keep the 5 models alive for as long as possible and dealing the DPS of a full health squad. If your enemy has 2 riflemen closing in, and one stops closing in and gets into cover, the priority is now on focusing the new rifle squad that's full health, because he will now be closing in the distance and he will be dealing close range damage with the Grenadiers, and he will be dealing much more damage than the Grenadiers, really. While the other rifle squad, even if it's low health, it's still dealing the full DPS of a full health squad, unless he just dropped too many models, but usually that doesn't happen like that. So you have 2 squads that are dealing full DPS and you closed in the distance for the most part. Versus Austere, the only squad you will eventually need to be careful of mid-game is the Panzer Grenadiers. The best way to deal with them is to either use the Stuart, obviously, but that isn't using the Riflemen. But with Riflemen, the best way to deal with them is to use smoke to close in the distance. This is assuming the Panzer Grenadier isn't alone and is supported by more units. This way, even if you are getting into close range with them, you did it without taking too much health damage closing in the distance. And that means that your Rifleman can still win out the engagement. Versus OKW though, it's a whole different beast. It's like you're playing the USF of Axis. And your rifle movement is a lot more like playing Austere with Grenadiers. You use a lot more cover, you only close in when the Stern Pioneer isn't around. If he is, you always focus fire it and keep it at range. Lobbing versus OKW is also generally much more acceptable. The main idea is catching squads out of position, like I mentioned in my matchups video. And if that isn't possible, then make good use of cover to stall engagements and eventually try and get up close with Volks. Many times when versus an equally skilled opponent, it will be mostly a stalling match until you can get your HMG out, which then will turn all the early engagements in your favor. Overall versus OKW, your aggression has to be a lot more measured, and rushing is only really possible after the Stern Pio is dealt with, or if the Stern Pioneer isn't in that side of the map. So the main rule against OKW, and I know that most USF players really struggle against OKW, is you need to see where the Stern Pioneer is. Because if you have the information where the Stern Pioneer is, then you can either close the distance against Volk's Grenadiers that aren't in the general area of the Stern Pioneer and win the engagement, or you can pick out the Stern Pioneer at long range, make him retreat back to base, and then take advantage of that. So against OKW, don't feel bad that you aren't winning the early game really, because OKW is the faction that can go hand to hand with USF on the early game stages. Your main focus really is to get that lieutenant out as soon as possible, and then try and counter the mechanized or the flag abstract that's coming in, and then you can start using the combined arms approach with Riflemen. Also, getting the double BARs as soon as possible before the OKW Volksgrenadiers get VET is also really important. When they do get the STGs and the VET, they pair up against Riflemen pretty well. I would even say that in many maps it's hard for Riflemen to do anything against vetted STG Volks. So really try to take advantage of the timings of USF against OKW. Really the most important timing is if you can get the BARs out before the Volks really are in any position to counter that. As my last point, I just want to target some specific things that you can consider versus Austere and OKW that aren't really connected to Rifleman usage. When playing Austere, consider that it's likely that unless you have a perfect early game, they will always hit their 2-2 timing, since the fuel needed for it isn't really that big. With that said, you can use the timing at where he's taking for the 2-2 to be more aggressive, as he won't be able to reinforce everything and keep the 2-2 timing out. Also, after the 2-2, restricting his fuel is more important, so he doesn't hit a good Panzer IV timing. Basically, before 2-2 and moments after that, that is where he's also trying to get the med bunker out. So your main objective is manpower attrition. He will have low health squads because he still doesn't have the bunker. He was using all his resources to tech for the 2-2. So forcing engagements is very good then. After that, you want to hit his P4 timing. So try to have a special focus on cut-off maneuvers and sneakily decapping his high fuel. You don't even need to cap it for yourself. If the game has a lot of action, just decap it. Some other considerations are when transitioning from mid to late game, and the game is somewhat even, already start building up to one of those 3 USF late game compositions that I spoke about earlier. Even if maybe 2 Shermans right now seems like the best choice since you are only slightly ahead, or even fairly ahead, it probably won't close out the game. If your opponent is somewhat aware of what you're doing, it can be very risky, even if you have 2 Shermans out. You just need to have the pack gun supported by something. It might happen that your Shermans gets hit by a mine, you never know, but it's not the safest approach, unless you are just that much ahead. So when you get to this stage, you really need to start thinking about transitioning to that perfect unit composition that gives you the best chances to survive late game versus Austere. Also, the grenade tech that I haven't mentioned before. It can be really good after the 3rd Rifleman and before the Lieutenant, to surprise your opponent with grenades and to do a push when the grenades are out and you have 2 Riflemen, and maybe clear out an MG or surprise some Grenadier squad and get a wipe. It's really good also in general later on for dislodging MGs, and I would say that at some point it's a must-have just because you want smoke on your rear echelon squads and your lieutenant squad and your captain squad. I wouldn't really consider it versus OKW though. Versus OKW you have other priorities that use munitions, so just use it versus Austere, I would say. When playing against OKW though, consider that the early game will be much harder. Unless you are playing with mechanized commander and using the Jeep, it's likely that you won't be able to deny much fuel to your opponent. So that means he will hit the Puma soon after you have your Steward out in 90% of your games, or even have the Flak out much sooner. So it's important really that you do some manpower conservation early on, so you can get the combined arms approach out sooner. This is considering you weren't able to do a perfect start versus OKW where you were able to get some of his infantry back to base. I would also consider late game the Jackson to be a must-have versus OKW and to be your first tank out of the major in preparation for the OKW P4 that has a lot more armor than the austere counterpart. It's a really big mistake I think I see many people doing, which is getting a Sherman out and then the OKW has a Panzer IV out and you really have no way to counter the OKW P4. So when you can do the Sherman, but if you do, it's good. You only do that if you have an AT gun out already. Zooks aren't really good versus OKW for the most part. Also, another thing that I will mention, and that I remember I said to this over on someone on Reddit, and I think it's a really good strategy versus OKW in general. The Airborne Commander versus OKW is really good because you can go for the Lieutenant here and have the Steward, and then you can drop AT guns and support the Stewards with AT guns to counter the Puma. Anyways, this is all for this extensive guide on the USF faction. If you want more in-depth matchup specific things, go over to the other videos I have now. I think I might only have one OKW matchup video for now. But if you are watching this in the future, it's likely that I have more. And also I have an old USF guide that for the most part is not up to date with how the game is now, but the Rifleman section is still really useful. The rest is up to you to spam games and get the feeling for it. So thanks for watching.